Hello, everyone, and welcome to Spiff Film Talk. I'm Mickey Duzdovich, Senior Programmer here at Santa Barbara International Film Festival. Tonight's film, we're going to be talking about 7 Dates with Death, and joining us is the director, Mike Holland. Thank you so much for being here, Mike.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor.
So, Mike, let's start from the beginning. How did you discover Maurice and this story of his?
Sure. So back in 2016, my roommate, Austin Quinn, connected me with his mother, who had written the book Back from the Dead, which followed everyone who had gotten off in 1972 off of death row by a Supreme Court ruling. And so we connected and we tried to discuss, like, what is the documentary angle on this? What's the short documentary angle on this? And we decided on Maurice himself. And so we had connected, and then she put me in contact with him. And then we traveled up to Oakland to meet and shoot with Maurice.
Very nice. Now, this film, you make the choice to create reenactments of what happened and reenactments in the jail cell and everything. Can you talk a little bit about having that choice and telling the story with the reenactments?
Sure. So that was actually something I was like quite nervous about tackling. You don't want a film that's entirely talking heads. I mean, you can, but you want to be able to bring the film to life in some way. And so I had written out the reenactments, and I went into it thinking this could go either way. This is a coin toss. This could be really corny, or I had been really inspired by Earl Morris at the time, who does those so masterfully. I love it. And so I just went into it saying, hey, let's give it a go. We have to find a way to really build up this story visually and just deliver something that's interesting to watch and make it suspenseful. So then when I watched the first cut of it, I kind of like was so married to it at the time where I just I didn't really like know what I had. So I brought in some friends and I was like, hey, like, is this corny to you? Is this like late night television, or is this a compelling film? And they said, we love it. So that's, you're not sure whether or not to trust them, but I felt good about it. I felt really good about it. It's definitely, that was definitely one of the biggest challenges, is pulling that off in a way that's tasteful. There's a lot of like hidden rules. Like, you don't necessarily want to show people's faces too much. You don't want to be overly dramatic or melodramatic. So I had shot those actually about a year and a half after I shot the interview itself. And I shot those. So I shot the interview in Oakland, which we can go into that process because that's a longer story. But I shot the recreations in upstate New York, and so I had to make it look like Louisiana. So that was also difficult. The snow had just melted, and I was like, thank God, absolutely thank God. So snow had just melted. I'd bust up these actors from New York. I'd got all my props. I got a cabin in the woods. And then I shot that part, and then I went and I had to find a jail cell, and that was more challenging. In New York and LA, you can find a jail cell pretty easily, but I needed something that was a little bit dated. So I reached out to the Film Commission of Syracuse and asked if they had anything for me. And they said, actually, we have a prison that's been abandoned. No one's gone in it since 1994 when it closed down. Excuse me. And we'd like to use you as a guinea pig because we'd like to have this is a small production, so we'd like to have actual television shows come up here and use this. So we'd like to try you out. So I went in there, and this is long-winded, but it's well worth it. I went in there, and there was no lights, there was nothing. We're using our flashlights. We were finding notes on the ground from that daughters wrote to their fathers that had been there for over 20 years. And it was just eerie. It was just so eerie. And then we brought in our own lights and we lit it, and it just scared the shit out of us the whole time we were up there. Me and my cinematographer, one PA, and a few actors. And the way that those prisons, the doors work is an old school crank and lever at the end of the hallway. And so that's how we were operating it the whole time. In the morning, my cinematographer set up a fog machine and set the fire alarm off in the building, and got like pretty much every fire truck in Syracuse coming there. We got a call from the film commissioner, who was only like a 35-year-old. This is maybe like an entry-level job for him, and he was like, "I trust you guys, like, don't screw this up." And we're like, "We promise we won't." We had the fire trucks there. I put my cinematographer in one of the prison cells to shoot through the bar, so we then closed the door behind him, and it jammed and it broke, and he was stuck in there for about 3 hours, and we could not get it. We were messing with this crank and handle. I even went to the hardware store and bought just like every tool I could find to try to break him out of here. But as it turns out, it's not so easy to break out of prison. And so he was in there, Garrett Nicholson, he was in there for about 3 hours, and we called the fire department again, and they came through with a high-powered saw and cut him out, and we were able to finish the recreations there. But that was an adventure in itself, which is not necessarily like, and maybe it's because I'm a documentary filmmaker. I'm just like, I'm not as used to shooting setup scenes like that. And that probably could have been better handled, but we were young guys and just figuring it out. So, it all got done in the end.
Yeah, no, it looks great, and I was wondering, you mentioned the lighting. I was going to actually ask about that, because I know prison cells, they tend to be much darker, and you have this wonderful light where it looks like it's a natural light coming through. And can you talk a little bit more about how you lit it?
Sure, that was actually very tricky, just because we had about like 2 little mini tungsten lights on stands, and with bars and with equipment, and just uh, the exposed piping of the hallway and the cells, it just created a lot of shadows, stuff you just didn't want to see. So that was actually one of the trickiest parts, besides the prison cell themselves. Just getting that right, and not overexposing. That was tricky. It was kind of like balancing like a broom on your fingertip, just trying to get everything right. Like it was right, and then someone might like kick the light stand a little, and then it took another 15 to 20 minutes to get everything back together. But that being said, the bars and everything, it does create a very dramatic atmosphere. So we were helped by that a lot.
How long were you able to get the prison for to shoot at?
We had it for about, I think, 6 or 7 hours. By the end of it, the film commissioner wanted to tear my head off. He came back. I mean, once our cinematographer was locked in the prison cell, and I was just like, at that point, I was stressed. I was so stressed. You know how it is being a director. It's like everything's on you, and I was so stressed. And then after 3 hours of just trying to break him out, I could only laugh. I'd be like, this is just out of my control. And and to some degree, it's not necessarily all on me. They gave me a location that hadn't been stepped in for decades, and I was the first one to figure it out. But we just had it for a bit, and then thankfully some of the actors agreed to extend their trip a little bit, because I had them going back on buses it was a 4-hour bus ride up, and then I was sending them back on buses in a few hours, so they agreed to stay a little longer and help me out.
Now there are multiple scenes, cutaway scenes, where you focus in on like a shotgun shell, blood going down the drain, but what makes it really pop is that those are most all red. And can you talk a little bit about the importance of putting something like that in the film, where it pulls the attention of the audience member?
Sure. I think those detailed shots are some of the most important, because it breathe. When you have something that feels like it's a symbol or an object, but still has some motion, whether it's blood running down a drain or a shotgun shell smoking, it lets the words of the narrator just kind of absorb, and it gives it a moment where you're not, when a human being sees a face, it's human nature to try to read that face and dissect that face and see what's going on. Likewise, if there's action, when there's people walking down the hall, but just those symbols kind of, it, for lack of a better term, it's almost like like a cinematic screensaver, where it's just like, it just takes a pause and you can really take in a moment. So I always tried to find little bits and pieces of that, whether it was, sometimes the recreations are more literal. He's saying, oh, I held a Bible over my chest to not get stabbed in the middle of the night in my cell. And that you show, him holding a Bible, but other moments with him holding a match, the shotgun shell, you just want to really, I think it lets the viewer put themselves in his shoes by like just taking a step back and not trying to dissect everything that's going on screen for a second.
Yeah. And let's talk about Maurice himself. He
Sure.
seems like such a polite and kind individual, and so peaceful and at peace with what he had to go through. And since you got to spend time with him, can you talk a little bit about the interview process with him and what you've learned from him that may have not made it into the movie?
Sure. So going back to the beginning, where I had connected with Joan, and we just kind of tried to figure out how so in her book, she had many subjects who were released from death row in 1972, but that doesn't necessarily mean released from prison. As it explains in this film, a life sentence was 10 years and then 6 years parole. And then when they abolished the death penalty, they changed it to a natural life. So life means life, which could mean 25 years. It depends, on the state and the situation. So she did a whole range of subjects. Some were still in prison and some had been released. And it was, and we, we were kind of like, how do we tackle this? Who do we start with first? And it just seemed like Maurice was just the obvious choice, aside from his story being so compelling and his heart being so pure. He was 97, and so you have a clock that you're dealing with, and the goal was, let's just go get this interview as soon as we can, because we don't know how much longer we'll be able to. And fortunately, we did when we did, because a few years later, he had passed away. So we were very thankful that we decided to do that at that moment. So me, Garrett, and Joan, Garrett, my cinematographer, and Joan is the executive producer of this short film. We got on a plane and went to Oakland. And I'd known Maurice had done some press in the past, but he hadn't made a film. He hadn't done anything like this. He'd maybe done a radio talk show or some advocacy pieces. And so my idea in my head was, let's take this slow. I want him to feel comfortable with us. We're really asking him to divulge a lot of traumatic things. So maybe we just hang out the first day and not do anything. And we get there and we meet Maurice, and he's living in an apartment in Oakland. And the first thing he asked is like, when are we shooting? And I was like, oh man, I was like prepared, because I had been thinking of everything I wanted, exactly what I wanted this film to be, but I was not in that moment. And so and then I slowly realized, okay, he just wants to get this out of the way. He does not enjoy talking about, these moments. They're traumatic, and you can't blame him. That it is tough, and he's done it before, and we're asking him to do it again. And so we set up, the camera. We do a little bit of an interview. He loves to just tell stories, so you don't really have to say much. I maybe got in like 5 questions, but we were always getting off topic, and I try to guide it back to, you know, the structured story that we kind of needed for this to really tell this in a short format. Um, and he'd brush on some things and then just jump off topic again. And I was like, what is going on here? Like I'm not quite sure, you know, how to really steer this. It just feels like completely out of my control. And I don't want to be so blunt as to say, you know, tell me about these terrible things, please. Like I'm not trying to exploit this man if he doesn't want to talk about it. And so we kind of say, all right, that was fine. We did that interview for like 2 hours, but I didn't use a single shot from that first interview, nothing in that. So we say, all right, let's try again. Next day, me, Joan, Garrett, we all go fishing. That's Maurice's favorite thing to do. He loved to fish. So we went out fishing, and he was teaching us how to fish. Unfortunately, he didn't catch a thing all day, and we were pretty bummed. But then afterwards, we set up the camera a little bit at the docks and asked him some questions. And then he was starting to open up a little bit, but still it wasn't what we needed. And at that point, I was maybe trying to pry a little bit. And then he said, all right, I'm done. And he took Joan aside because he had a previous relationship with Joan. And he said, who are these guys you brought here? Who like, did you bring amateurs? And so that confused me. And we had a long talk about this back at our hotel we were staying at. It's like, why does he believe we are amateurs? And then it boiled down to the point where I was asking questions he had already answered in the press, but he just wasn't privy to the process. And this was a huge learning lesson for me. To sometimes allow your subject to understand your process and what you're trying to create. I know sometimes as filmmakers, we want to keep that distance.
Yeah.
So they're not, the subjects are not aware of the outcome that you're trying to achieve. So that way, maybe you get a more natural documentary, someone would perceive, but he had no idea I was really trying to get him to tell his story in what I would turn into a compact way. So I have to ask him questions he's already answered a ton of times. We have to get a story from beginning, middle to end in a clear way. And in that moment, I realized he thinks I'm doing like some type of TV interview, so, you know, or I'm writing something that's where I can pull from sources that already exist. And it's like, no, this is, you've done interviews where other people have told your story, or you've gone on radio where you have a host, where there's just other people involved, but this film is 100% from your mouth. This is going to be you telling your story. I don't like to include myself. I don't love to be on camera, and I don't feel like I have anything to add to that story besides being able to turn it into something cohesive. That is my value to that story. Besides that, you're wasting time if you're showing my face asking him questions. So we went back the next day, and I was like, I just have to explain to him exactly what I'm trying to do. So I said what I just told you. I said, we're trying to tell your story with you as the sole narrator from beginning to end, to have as a record and to have as a film and have it live on. And something clicked in his head. And his eyes lit up, and he was like, I get it. You know, he didn't necessarily say that, but he got it. And at that point, we set up the camera, and he was just on a roll. Again, I wasn't asking many questions. He knew exactly the story to tell, but he had been avoiding what we needed the whole time until he understood the form and until he understood what the goal was. And then it was just a breeze from there. But for the first few days, I thought we were going to leave empty-handed. And I, you know, you don't want to frustrate your subject, especially someone who's gone through trauma. It's not worth it. It's not worth it to put someone through trauma again. But he thought I was being redundant, and it was something else entirely. So once we all were on the same page, we just got through that final interview. Everything you see in the film is from that final interview, in that final interview alone. And so I'm happy, you know, that was a lesson learned, I guess I'd say, is sometimes you really just have to let people in, and you can't be so coy about your process.
Yeah, he's seems like such a seems like he was such a great storyteller, because it didn't seem like you had to make many cuts or edits to put that story together. It seemed like he flowed so perfectly. Can you talk a little bit about the editing process for this film and making it so it did feel like a free flowing story?
Sure. So the film really is edited entirely on a Word document. You take the transcript, you break it down, and then you copy and you paste sections, um, and then you do a pass that way. And so you have 5 hours of interviews, and then you realize, okay, now I have 1 hour, and now I have 30 minutes, and now I have 15 minutes, and now I have 10 minutes. And that's very difficult to do. The editing was very difficult to do in that way, where you I like to tell stories in as short of time as possible. Um, I believe that's, especially in today's world. I don't want to like, say that everyone likes short form content, because that's not always the case. But certainly if you're going to do a subject like this, which is also pretty heavy, my goal is to allow people to view this film who might not usually go on Netflix or Amazon and click on death row documentaries. That's a commitment. You just finished
Yeah.
up a big, heavy week of work, and you want to watch something really fun, and something exciting and something thrilling. That's not always everyone's first pick. So I wanted to kind of reach an audience I might not have, and I felt that 10 minutes might have been the best way to do that, as someone who's like, okay, I can watch my fun stuff after this. I still have time. But yeah, so the editing's difficult to break it down, but finally I got to a point where I'm like, this is how I feel like I tell the story. Of course, there could be more context, and there's also the difficulty of only using a single narrator. So any information that was not received through him was either had to be found through found footage, archives, old news clips. I was able to use some text blocks to explain certain things, but there's just some things you have to give up on, and you're like, you know what? Hopefully, if someone wants to really learn the history of Furman versus Georgia, or anything else here, they can do some research afterwards. But what I'm here to do is tell this man's story. So that's kind of what I had to remember and keep in the back of my mind. The other difficult part of it was he's not quite easy for everyone to understand. Um, and he's an old man, he's lost teeth, there's a heavy accent involved, there's so many reasons, and for that reason I had to use subtitles. And that was a bit challenging, because I've noticed in certain films where they're foreign language films, you can use English subtitles and kind of paraphrase what's being said in the convenience of time or whatever it is. You just have to get across what they're saying. But in
Yeah.
this case, you can still kind of understand what he's saying, but you can't paraphrase. And so I did not have that convenience when he might use a saying or a certain set of words that kind of just trailed off in the end or the beginning, which just made the subtitles clunky, and sometimes made the he might be referring to God, and then he goes on and on and on, and he's still talking about God, and then he said something told me or whatever, and you're like, well, I kind of want to let people know he's talking about God there, and he's just kind of uses his words in almost like a jazz like way, and that was very difficult. I guess it was contrasting to my filmmaking style, which is very compact and
Yeah.
succinct. But eventually it kind of all worked out, and I would even ask Joan. I'd be like, I don't even know what this word is. It could be this or that, and so we'd kind of have to figure out, even at some points, what he was saying. But it was never a complete thought that we were lost in. It was only just like one or two words, and in the end, that's not the biggest deal. But yeah, that was also a challenge.
And you mentioned the archival footage and news clips and stuff. How much research had to go in to find exactly what you wanted?
Wasn't a lot. I only ended up using a few of those clips. Thankfully, I had Joan, who is an expert on the subject, and
Yeah.
I was able to do a lot of research myself. But she, she was really, um, the anchor behind the history here and behind the subjects, and she was really able to guide me. She had been a lawyer. The reason she got into this, she was a lawyer who represented this man on death row,
Yeah.
and she had intended to represent him. It kind of just fell into her lap, and he ended up being executed, and so that's what drew her into this world, and she was really able to enlighten me on all the history and facts and all the points we needed to hit. So I mean, she was a huge resource.
And you don't oversaturate the film with a musical score. But you have a very faint musical score throughout. Can you talk a little bit about that choice?
Sure. Again, I was super. I mean, he's probably my favorite documentary filmmaker is Errol Morris. I love his style, and I just felt like it was fitting for the story. He had done stuff on the death penalty before, and so I was like, I think this is a good format. And then I just tried to make it my own. So I worked with this talented musician, Nicholas Warner, who I put in. You know, I was a little hesitant to put in, some of placeholder tracks as I'm editing, because I don't want someone composing something that's just not going to end up working tonally for the project. So I had placeholder tracks, and then it's like, okay, now I've fallen in love, and this happens to every filmmaker.
Yeah.
Now I've fallen in love with these placeholder tracks, and then I have to send it off to this guy who I know is really talented, but is anything going to beat what I have already in there? And he was able to do an amazing job, and I have no idea what those placeholders were anymore.
Yeah.
Long gone, and but I wanted the soundtrack is repetitive, and I wanted it to be repetitive. I mean, I think there's one section that goes on for almost 5 minutes of the same song. It's not supposed to drag you out of the moment. It's supposed to, especially in that moment, in that middle section where it goes on for a long point.
Yeah.
It's supposed to feel like you're in the penitentiary for 37 years. It's not an easy part of the film to get through. That's where he talks about some of the darkest things he went through, and yeah. So I just really wanted to cement that thought in people's mind.
And then I wanted to mention the credit scene itself, because you actually have footage of his funeral. Can you tell us a little bit about when you heard about his passing and actually decided to put that footage in?
Yeah. So unfortunately, it was a small funeral, and unfortunately I wasn't able to go, and neither was Garrett, but Joan and her husband and partner in many of these things, Dennis, went down and filmed the funeral, which is beautiful, and they got beautiful footage from it, and it just felt like it just felt very fitting to put in the end. I mean, you just kind of it looks like he had an amazing funeral, and there were people there that loved him and respected him, and there was people there for him in the end. And I didn't really intend to tell a feel-good story, but his attitude shaped that into what it was. By all means, it shouldn't be a feel-good story. And the fact that he was respected and loved in the end just really emphasizes that. So it just felt right. It just really it felt like here's the story of this man, and he went out and in his words, a marvelous way.
Yes, I would say so. Well, it is a gorgeous film, Mike, and I thank you so much for joining us tonight. And thank you for being a part of the Spiff family and alumni. And hopefully your future projects will find their way across our desk.
I'd love that. Awesome.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Take care, Mike.
Thanks.